Human rights due diligence during COVID-19 and lessons for the future. This is a very large topic with many angles to it, and some of them are being explored through other panels during the forum. So we obviously won't cover everything today, but we're going to do our best. I'm Rachel Davis. I'm the Vice President and co-founder of SHIFT. SHIFT is a non-profit organization headquartered in New York, although I'm speaking to you from Australia, which is a slightly more friendly time zone for today's discussion. We are the leading center of expertise on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. We help to write the guiding principles, and for the last decade, we've been putting them into practice with a wide range of partners from business, government, and civil society. It's great to be with the other panelists today. We have a wonderful group of speakers. I'm very excited to get to them and to have all of you hear from them. But before we do, we appreciate that we have a video message from the Commissioner of the Directorate General for Justice at the European Commission, Didier Reynders. As some of you who are joining us today may be aware, DG Justice commissioned a critical study on human rights due diligence in supply chains, the focus for what we'll talk about today, and made that public a couple of months ago. And following that, announced that they would be taking forwards a consultation to explore potential further developments, regulatory and otherwise, on human rights due diligence at the EU level. So without saying more, let me hand it to our technical team who will play the video from Commissioner Reynders.
I would like to thank the United Nations Development Programme for organizing this multi-stakeholder forum on responsible business and human rights for Asia Pacific in Bangkok, and of course for inviting me. I'm not able to be physically with you today, but it's my pleasure to address you through this video. The coronavirus has tested welfare systems, societies, and economies across the world. The future has been cast into uncertainty, and millions of people have lost their jobs. This crisis underscores the importance of a sustainable and resilient economy. It has revealed weaknesses in our businesses and unregulated global supply chains. Investors speak about the need to recognize human rights violations and inequality as systemic risk, similarly to climate change. The crisis also showed the importance for businesses to consider the interests of stakeholders and to have proper processes to identify and address adverse impacts on people, planet, and society. For a sustainable economic recovery, we need to address the key issues. The first is the focus on short-term financial performance. Over the time, shareholder payouts significantly increased to the detriment of medium to long-term investments, which are needed for the sustainability transformation. The second problem are unregulated supply chains. These significantly harm human rights and the environment. Our aim is to tackle both issues. It is important to clarify in the duties of directors that stakeholders' interests are important for the sustainability of the company. Directors need to integrate sustainability risks and human rights into the corporate strategy and adopt science-based targets. A horizontal human rights due diligence obligation can address the challenges linked to supply chains. This approach is strongly supported by front-runner businesses and other stakeholders and is in line with the 2011 United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Companies need to engage in transformative changes so that the global sustainability transition can become a reality. The European Green Deal and the Recovery Plan see a sustainable corporate governance initiatives as an important catalyst for a sustainable recovery. I am committed to this future initiative and will continue to listen to all parties in its development. I wish you all a productive forum and look forward to receiving feedback from your discussions.
Thank you very much to colleagues at the European Commission for organising that, and again to all of you who have joined us in the last few minutes. That was a video comment from Commissioner Didier Reynders, the head of DG Justice at the European Commission. I would now like to turn to the speakers we have with us for today's discussion and briefly introduce them. I'll then make a few comments to set the context and then get straight into the conversation. So our speakers, we have today Christina Tibales, who is the acting head of the Center for Responsible Business Conduct at the OECD. We have Shubha Sekar, who is the Director for Human Rights in the Indian subcontinent, MENA, Turkey and Caucasus regions for Coca-Cola. We have Payal Jain, who is Supply Chain Manager with H&M based in the region. We have Tara Dermott, Head of China, Sub-Office for the International Organization on Migration. And we have Livio Sarandrea, Team Leader of Business and Human Rights Asia at the UN Development Programme. Thank you to all of you for joining. A few comments to really set the scene before we dive into the discussion. We know we're all here because we know that people all over the world are facing threats to their health, livelihoods, civil liberties, privacy, among other human rights, including, I'm sure, some of you who are joining this session or those you work with or whose rights you advocate for. At the same time, we know that companies, many companies, are facing, in some cases, existential threats to their business models connected to COVID-19. And in the face of the incredibly difficult decisions that are being taken and have to be made, we all want confidence that risk to people is going to be at the heart of those decisions, whether they're being made by business or by governments. Human rights due diligence is defined in the UN Guiding Principles as an ongoing process through which business should identify risks to people, prioritize them on the basis of their severity, where that's necessary, take action to mitigate or remediate them, including by using leverage with business partners and others, track the effectiveness of those approaches, and communicate with stakeholders and others about what the business is doing. It's different, as many of you know, from other forms of due diligence that are focused on protecting against risk to the business, because our focus here is on protecting against risk to people. And that means that the integration of affected stakeholder perspectives, rights holders whose lives and livelihoods can be directly impacted in connection with what a business does right throughout the value chain, those stakeholders' perspectives need to be part of human rights due diligence. Without that, it's not human rights due diligence. For these reasons, we really see human rights due diligence as essential to building back better. It's a key way in which we're going to be able to get those perspectives into decisions that are made about building more sustainable jobs, sustainable sectors, and supply chains that integrate respect for people and planet. At Shift, in the work that we do on the UN Guiding Principles, we're already seeing some of the ways in which businesses are using human rights due diligence processes to inform these difficult decisions. I'll highlight 4 examples that we called out in a recent publication you can find on our website. We're seeing businesses, for example, number 1, focusing first in the decisions they are making on those who are the most vulnerable to impacts, wherever they are in the supply chain. So not just looking first at tier 1, but going to where the harms and the impacts may be the greatest. Secondly, we're seeing some businesses involve stakeholders in the difficult decisions that need to be made. That could be through existing relationships with trade unions or with expert NGOs or others. The third thing we're seeing is businesses advocating with governments about the broader policy responses that are going to be needed, including safety nets for workers and many other measures going forward. And the fourth thing we're seeing is businesses trying to communicate about how they're making these decisions and how they're factoring risks to people into them in order to try and build trust and confidence. But I think perhaps most challenging of all, and where we see fewer examples, is the need for businesses to take a hard look at where human rights risks that have been highlighted and are being highlighted in the pandemic are connected to their business models. We know that commitments to temporarily support contract or migrant workers, or to honor contracts with suppliers, are very positive. They're very welcome, and we want them to be more widespread. So it's not to devalue them, but I think when we see those kinds of commitments, it raises questions for us, for the businesses that are making them, about what that says about underlying human rights risks, and can that be addressed going forwards in a way that is not temporary or restricted in time. And we think that this is at the heart of truly tackling the vulnerabilities and the inequality that we see needs to be tackled if we are actually going to rebuild the world differently from what it has been. At the same time, it can be unrealistic to expect individual businesses to tackle these kinds of systemic business model risks if others aren't going to do it as well. And we certainly see some of this behind the urgency in the last few months around the debate over mandatory human rights due diligence in over a dozen EU countries, and now, as you heard, at EU level itself. We know that, as Commissioner Reynders said, there are a number of front-runner businesses, including some that are very active in this region, including one on this panel, as well as many other stakeholders who are supporting a discussion about what kind of mandatory human rights due diligence could be fit for purpose at EU level. And we know that this is would be in line with the UNGPs. So we'll all be keeping a close eye on regulatory developments in that region in the months to come. But with that said, let me turn now to our panelists. And I would like to start by putting a question to Christina and Livio, please. You know, I've said a little bit of the context, but please, you both sit in positions where you have great insight into what's going on regionally in Europe, globally in the case of the OECD, regionally in the Asia Pacific, of course, Livio for UNDP there. Help us build the context out further. Broadly speaking, what new challenges for businesses are you seeing in response to COVID-19 in how they carry out human rights due diligence? And which companies, in your view, seem to be best prepared for these challenges?
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you very much also for giving us a bit of background about the situation. And as you said, the COVID crisis has had and is still having massive disruptive effects on the economy and on business activity, with a ripple effect through entire supply chains. And the lockdown and confinement measures have directly or indirectly affected companies and populations in the entire world. So a totally unique situation for companies and workers. And basically the entire economy has been in a state of hibernation and is still recovering from that. And this has resulted in massive layoffs, cancellations of orders, cancellation or delays of payments, which in turn has had massive impacts on workers and their dependents, and of course, massively also on people engaged in the informal economy. And one of the effects of the crisis has also been the difficulty to monitor practices on the ground, and you already hinted to that in your presentation, due to the impossibility, for example, for auditors or inspectors to travel and do the work. And this in turn has increased abuses, illegal practices, corruption, and environmental harms, for example. So it's not just a crisis on human rights, it's a crisis on entire aspects of business behavior and impacts on people. So these circumstances have shown us really the worst and best behaviors of companies, and we have seen companies totally unable to cope with the challenges and going into a freeze, letting the workers and their suppliers down. But we have also seen wonderful examples of companies prioritizing workers' health and safety and using their resources really to jump in and support the management of the crisis, producing essential goods, organizing transportation of people and goods, etc. And I'm sure we will hear some of these good examples later in the panel. At the OECD, we have produced numerous policy notes, statistics, and reviews on all aspects of the economy. And at the OECD Center for Responsible Business, we have also looked at the practices of companies during the crisis and also as part of the recovery. And what we have also done is to discuss directly with our stakeholders in different sectors and supply chains of what the challenges were for them and how they have addressed them. So we've talked to companies, NGOs, buyers, manufacturers, etc. So I'm just going to give you a brief summary of the findings we've had, both from our research, but also the direct input that we have received from our stakeholders. So clearly one of the good practices that has helped companies behave more responsibly and really be able to cope with the situation has been dialogue and stakeholder engagement. And there have been many modalities of that. But we have seen that companies that have been able to remain engaged with the stakeholders and the workers have really been much more able to cope with the situation, and including in situations which were already challenging before COVID, but where the challenges increased during this time. For example, in mineral supply chain, in crisis zones, we have seen that, for example, business initiatives like the Responsible Minerals Initiative has acted between upstream and downstream actors to ensure a flow of communication and exchange of data, and ensure that all sectors in the supply chains were properly engaged in coping with the situation. We have also seen that companies have changed the way in which they engage with the stakeholders and have, for example, used more the local NGOs to stay in touch with the suppliers. And we have also seen examples of companies joining forces to address abusive behaviors by their buyers. And one example, for example, is the Clothing Manufacturers Associations in Bangladesh that put out a statement threatening an association-wide embargo to address behaviors by some companies that were canceling orders from one manufacturer and then turning to another one to get exactly the same products. So we have seen also these self-defense practices by some companies. Of course, companies that already had in place environmental health and safety management systems in place to cope with crisis were much better prepared also to cope with this situation. And we saw the example of, for example, the National Mining Association of Peru that issued protocols of how to engage with local populations to ensure their health and safety during these times. And of course, corporate governance approaches that ensure leadership and a clearly defined responsibility for disaster continuity and contingency planning has been essential. And I think I will finish with this, but what we have also seen is that investors have reacted very positively to this kind of behavior, where they have seen leadership by companies in addressing the crisis. They have seen this as a sign also of the resilience of the company and of the ability to deal with impacts and generate value over the long term. So the good behavior by companies has also been detected not only by the immediate stakeholders, but also for the investors going forward. So I think I will pass on to Livio now. Thank you.
Livio, I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Christina, for passing the baton. And I will be echoing some of the points you have made, because indeed the issues that you pointed out at the global level are very similar to those that I've seen in the region where I am based. But before I do that, allow me, and Rachel, please allow me on behalf of all the co-organizers to thank Commissioner Reinders for his intervention, and indeed to thank all the people in Brussels and in Bangkok, the EU colleagues who have made this possible. Commissioner Reinders thanked UNDP, but indeed you should have thanked all the organizers of this forum. I found his message very powerful. It made me think about a statement made yesterday by Anita Ramasastry when she said, business and human rights is a train that is picking up speed. And it is with these actions that this train is indeed picking up speed. Is with this bold statement on the Green Deal, on the approaches that the EU is having on environmental and human rights mandatory due diligence, that really is an incredible boost also in the motivation of all those of us that are working in this space. And as Rachel said, similar statements have been made by many other countries, and I'll come back to that later. So generally speaking, yes, we are seeing a train picking up speed. That's certainly true as a general statement. But going back to the specific context of what we are discussing today, COVID-19, and perhaps using the same analogy, the train came to some type of level crossing, we can say, during the COVID-19 period, or perhaps stopped to a station for some time, hopefully for not a long time, to download some people and to get on board more people, hopefully more people. We have actually seen in many parts, including in Asia, many reacting positively actually to the need to act more responsibly and to build back better. So we are at a very specific moment in time, certainly a more difficult time for human rights due diligence, more difficult time to, as Rachel said at the beginning, identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for adverse human rights impact. And this ability has certainly diminished. This is what we have seen in Asia in the last months. We live here, we have felt it on our own, how stringent were the lockdown measures in this region, measures that have been very effective, I have to say, from an health point of view, but have certainly brought a lot of consequences on the economy in general and on companies. So those same impacts were devastating, as it was said, for many companies, with buyers cutting orders, supply factories that have shut down in many places, and of course the consequence of millions of people losing jobs in Bangladesh, in India. We all know a big part of the global supply chain here is in Asia, so we have seen very strong impacts on the companies and of course on the rights holders. We have also witnessed here in Asia that especially the smaller ones, the smaller companies have had they've been taken by surprise, and they've had difficulties in identifying also the specific risks attached to this crisis. There are many resources on human rights impact assessments in general. There weren't until recent specific documents that would lead companies to look at the angle of the emergency, to look at what are the specific risks for companies, for rights holders, in fact, during the time of COVID-19. Well, humbly, we as UNDP try to fill a little bit of that gap by launching, and some of you might have seen it, a human rights due diligence rapid self-assessment toolkit that looks at 44 specific risks related to occupational health and safety, labor rights, obviously, preventing stigma and discrimination, and looking at specific impacts also on women and children. We have found that this tool was seen as very useful to many, was downloaded in thousands. We have seen many companies picking it up and many business associations in the region picking it up, translating it in languages. It's now translated in 8 different languages, many languages in the region. So it was brought to also the small and medium companies in the region. In fact, I want to thank Amphori for having most recently endorsed our tool and having shared it with all their members. So the other point I wanted to stress is that this is a rapid self-assessment toolkit. Obviously lacks a critical aspect of human rights due diligence, which is stakeholders engagement. This is obviously been very difficult to achieve in these days. And to give you a little bit the volume of the difficulties, I'd like to mention a survey that we have launched very recently, in fact, at the beginning of the week, of the ability of the CSOs working on business and human rights to reach the communities, to reach the vulnerable that we were talking about earlier. And the results are perhaps not surprising, but strikingly negative in terms of their ability to reach the communities. So the ability to monitor the violation is very much reduced. 56, for example, of those CSOs have reported that they cannot reach vulnerable populations due to the lockdown. 27% of them say that they're also facing threats of reducing the funding. So that ability is certainly very much reduced. And if CSO cannot reach the communities and monitor, we're flying blind somehow. So I'll close with perhaps a point on the fact that we are now in Asia in what would be called the recovery phase. The lockdown is being eased, and companies are in that recovery part. But it is very important to note that everyone is looking also at possibilities of a second wave. And so companies are using tools like ours also to prepare for a possible second wave of the COVID-19, to prepare for possible new pandemics, to prepare perhaps more broadly for emergencies, including those that may be connected eventually with the consequences linked to climate change. And I do hope our tool will be useful for that purpose. We will be upgrading it and sharing it as a tool for emergencies in total. I see that my time is up. I hope I'll be able to come back to that later. Back to you, Rachel.
Thank you very much, Livio. And as the author of a very relevant toolkit and one of the co-organizers, I didn't want to be cutting you short. And I think it's very important that people are aware of the self-assessment tool, but also of the challenge that both of your comments have highlighted, which is that, you know, companies are under pressure to make decisions, to work out what to do. And the natural instinct is just to do that internally. And it's in those moments when it can be very hard to say, this is when we need that external stakeholder perspective. And when we reach out to perhaps our usual partners and they themselves are under pressure, under threat, whether it's health threat or funding risk, it can be a struggle to work out who to turn to. So I think those are some extremely important dynamics that we know companies are grappling with. So on that, let me turn to the two companies that we have joining us today. Please, Shubha and Payal, I wanted to ask each of you in turn to share with us from a company perspective, you know, what are you able to do individually to tackle these heightened risks, particularly in your supply chains? Specifically, how do you need to adapt your existing approaches? But if you can also touch on this question of what can you do individually, where do you need those external partnerships, and where do you need greater collaboration with peers, given the challenges you're facing? If you can each share about 5 minutes of reflections with us, that would be great.
Thank you, Rachel. Very warm greetings to everybody from New Delhi. It's hot, very hot outside as we discuss a very hot and relevant topic. So I'd like to make 3 points. The first is that when the pandemic started, everybody was on a learning curve. There was no SOPs, no single way to measure, what is the impact, and there was no list of COVID-related human rights issues. Of course, Livio mentioned about the very, very useful UNDP, checklist. We had another very interesting checklist for IOM about, foreign workers and issues there. But broadly speaking, I mean, everybody was learning as they saw, and they had to act as they learned. So this is one. But as pointed out by Christina and Livio, those companies which had, were rooted in, solid values, which had stakeholder engagement processes, which had robust human rights policies and programs, which had, cross-functional crisis management teams and strong governance were able to respond quicker. I mean, so they had to quickly get their act together and try and address issues. The second point is that the salient human rights risk of a business continues to hold true even during the COVID and the recovery phase. It's not as though that there will be a whole new set of risks that come upon a business unless they change their business model and unless the supply chain changes. So those very much hold true, and I'll explain further what I mean. While the salient human rights risks, and this is a third point, while they broadly remain the same, the due diligence approaches need to be adapted according to the evolving situation. So these are the 3 points which kind of form the basis, and I will explain to you in the context of Coca-Cola. So we had a human rights team from 2005, and we've been focusing our efforts on our salient human rights risks. Now this is a big exercise that we did in 2015, where extensively we engaged with internal and external stakeholders, and we came up with 12 salient human rights risks. And these are communicated in our first human rights report in 2017. So these includes, for example, health and safety of workers, forced labor, child labor, migrant, issues with respect to migrant workers. These remain the same. It's only that in the COVID situation and post-COVID recovery phase, the risks become far more. They get magnified because the vulnerabilities are more. Poverty is a driver for a number of these issues. And so what I was trying to drive home is that we had prioritized our work in the sugar supply chain, because we felt that, we saw potential of such kind of issues in our sugar supply chain. And we started work in 2014. We have completed 20 country sugar studies, the last being in India, and where last year we completed it, and we've started the remediation program. Now, with this, given this knowledge of whatever we are seeing in this crisis period, we are all the more, determined to continue this work and from a business lead, to get in a multi-stakeholder platform with other companies, like-minded companies, both MNCs, Indian, other stakeholders, to address this systemically, because the issues are complex, and as been pointed out by the earlier speakers, no one entity or one business can make a difference, but when several like-minded organizations come together constructively, definitely, the one can move the needle. Apart from that, again, to give you an example from Coca-Cola about the due diligence tools, one important tool that we have is the auditing that we do in the 200 countries of, the bottling facility, our supply chain, basically the bottling facilities, the suppliers. And, we do 2,000, we've done about 25,000, over this period. And that becomes a very important way for us to test what is happening on the ground. Now, as has been mentioned, there was a pause because of the pandemic, and instead of twiddling our thumbs, we felt that let us try and test out new approaches using technology. Of course, there is nothing like an in-person, because there are important aspects of a workplace assessment, which is a health and safety walkthrough, where you're able to identify vulnerable groups, whether it's a young worker, whether it's a pregnant woman, whether it's a migrant worker. But we have to kind of evolve rather than doing nothing. We need to find methods of continuing to do due diligence, and so we kind of piloted the using technology remote assessment. This is not meant to supplant in-person assessments, but it is to supplement. So I would look at the due diligence as a kitty, kind of a basket of tools which we need to keep using, depending on the situation, and not just in pandemics. I mean, this has use in zones of conflicts where there is, rioting, for example, where there's law and order disturbance, maybe another wave of, because we need to be ready for the long haul. And going forward, I mean, to your point, Rachel, I think partnerships and collective action is the way forward. We need to get out of our silos. We need to kind of come together, given the fact that, the economic impact, the scarce resources, it's even more important for all of us to come together and leverage the scarce resources, and then, kind of try and address these very difficult systemic issues. I'm now handing over to Payal. Over to you, Payal.
Payal, you're on mute.
sorry. I said thanks, Shubha, and thank you for handing over, and thank you, Rachel, for setting the stage and also highlighting why human rights become even more important. Talking a little bit about H&M, human rights continue to be the core of our value system and business since the first time we established our code of conduct back in 1997. When we talk about the USP that we offer for our customers, fashion and quality at the best price in a sustainable way is something that we commit to our customers when they buy our products from our stores. COVID-19 has been the new reality, which has really surfaced some of the cracks in the systems and structures in the terms of roles and responsibilities that we as corporates, public sector and workers associations haven't been able to fulfill at large. Despite that, one of the most important work that we have been doing within our supply chains is securing that we meet the compliance regulations, work towards the aspirational value, and work towards the social development in terms of worker needs. One of the key examples that I would like to bring here is the lack of social protection systems, which becomes even more visible that there are great examples which we can learn from countries, but there are gaps in certain countries which, as individual companies and corporates, we have not been able to quick fix. And now when we have in the exceptional circumstances, it is important to highlight that the work together, working with the right actors and stakeholders to create sustainable solutions instead of fixing the broken pieces by individual actors has become even more visible. And one of the actions as our company, what we have done is endorsing to call to action, where we want to address quick measures, which is one of the minimum measures as a corporate that we do in terms of respecting our purchasing commitments. But also, as was highlighted already by Render, that we need to secure the midterm needs by financing solutions and near-term, long-term solutions in terms of supporting into the legal framework and establish a social sustainability or social security system where each party contributes their share, like in any other schemes. So now, even though post-COVID is not here, but we can clearly see the trends and very clearly that the demands on certain products will go down, and in order to meet what the customer needs, the plan has to be set in a different way. Long-term commitments, partnership approach, consolidated supply chain, and explicitly defining the demands and commitments within the legal framework where we need to secure a win-win-win approach. As we are in the midst of the pandemic, we also see the risks of vulnerable groups of people being affected, as you highlighted in the beginning. And as an example, within our industry in particular, we already see that a lot of trade union reps have been asked to leave, women workers being one of the vulnerable group, migrants, and a lot of other vulnerable groups which are affected. Our continuous work when it comes to these issues, working with Better Work at the ILO to respect fair recruitment practices and layoff requirements, has been a clear mandate towards our supply chain in order to secure that discrimination is not happening. But when it comes to also systems, these issues can be brought up to the right forum where we can address solutions with the suppliers, factories, and unions, and how we are doing as of now with the help of the national monitoring committees that exist in each country where our supply chains are. So we as H&M, we are a signatory to a global framework agreement, and as part of commitment to that agreement, we have practical structures in place, which are called the national monitoring committees, where the trade union partners, the suppliers, and us as corporates come and address these questions or grievances raised by the workers. The challenge, though, is then to have the transparency of these issues on a country level so that these can be addressed for the industry and is not just limited to one. And the way we do today is to create brand platforms and address through in the sphere of our relationship that exists. And a great example of that is the collaboration on digital payments with Better Than Cash Alliance, for example, in Bangladesh, where majority of the workers in Bangladesh have access to digital payments. Thus, the funds, the payments can be transferred digitally. I will stop here with those more concrete examples, and over to you, Rachel.
Thank you both, and thank you for giving very clear examples of work that you had already had underway that needed to be strengthened or escalated because of the nature of those escalating risks, as you said, Shubha. But also, Payal, to your point about the existing relationships and structures for ongoing engagement with trade unions and how important that is, also at a time when there are going to be renewed risks to trade union rights as well. You both talked about vulnerability, and I want to, Shubha, come back to you, but bring Tara into the conversation as well. We know that there are many different ways and intersections when we think about vulnerability in this context, in the human rights context, in connection with COVID-19. And one of those angles is risks to migrant workers and the specific vulnerabilities that they face. And I'd really like to hear from both of you. We know that migrant workers are often at risk of severe harm. This is even more true now when we look at labour recruitment supply chains, and what are some of the actions that companies can take to mitigate those heightened risks in this environment? Tara, let me come to you first, and then Shubha.
Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak specifically about migrant workers on this highly important panel. The hard truth is that what companies should be doing now is what they should always be doing. The real benefit, as has been highlighted, of robust human rights due diligence processes is that they not only strengthen a company's ability to react, but that they also enable enterprises to proactively identify and address key areas of risks in their operations and supply chains. IOM's call to all companies is that due diligence processes are inclusive of the unique needs, considerations, and risks for migrant workers. We must recognize the role that migrant workers continue to play as frontliners in essential sectors during COVID-19 and the vital role that they will play in recovery. As soon as production resumes, employers will need workers, and many of them will be migrants. Sadly, challenges to safe recruitment pervasive pre-COVID will persist post-COVID. So if business has not already made a commitment to ethical recruitment, including the elimination of worker-borne recruitment fees and costs, then they need to do so now urgently. Never has this issue been more important as we see the acute impacts of migrant debt hampering workers and their communities in coping with COVID-19. So by making this commitment, business can best ensure that current migrant employees are not trapped in situations of debt bondage, and they can also best prepare for re-employment and re-recruitment of workers during recovery. That said, making a commitment is not enough. Buyers and employers need to see it through by ensuring that their suppliers and business partners, including associated recruitment actors, are motivated and able to implement ethical recruitment practices. Employers need to embed ethical recruitment in robust due diligence systems and to harness the experience of migrant workers in the design of these ethical recruitment models. Now, a great example of this is the Responsible Recruitment Due Diligence Toolkit that IOM has developed in partnership with Apple and tested with recruiters, suppliers, and other businesses. It is essentially a how-to guide with practical tools for suppliers and labor recruiters. The basic architecture of this toolkit is that it follows the 6-step OECD framework for due diligence. And importantly, each step seeks to identify, assess, prevent, and mitigate risks associated with forced labor throughout the labor migration process. Now, fortunately, we now have a very good understanding as a result of multi-sectoral collaboration as to where workers are most vulnerable during recruitment and effective methods of mitigation and redress. So specific mitigation measures, which all fall under ethical recruitment practice, are that 0 fees should be charged to workers, that workers must retain their documents, and that clear contract terms and conditions are necessary to ensure that workers are informed of their rights and recourse from recruitment through employment and return. Now, this responsible recruitment due diligence toolkit includes tools that are simple and easy for suppliers to adopt. Self-assessment checklists, of which responses are linked directly with corrective action plan templates. Worker training records to ensure that migrant workers have access to important pre-departure and post-arrival based orientations. A recruitment fees and costs calculator, and important guidance as to how best to ensure that grievance mechanisms are accessible to migrant workers, as well as a remediation tracker. Now, I am pleased to share that in just a few months, IOM will make a version of this responsible recruitment due diligence toolkit public and available to all businesses as they navigate implementation of ethical recruitment.
Yeah, so thank you, Tara, for giving the the broad view. So I'll kind of get into some of the nuts and bolts of how we have addressed this. If you recall, I had mentioned in the previous part where I spoke that when we did the salient human rights risks, forced labor came out as one of the salient human rights risks. I mean, we as a company, we operate in 200 countries, and we are there in the Middle East and other parts where the economies are hugely dependent on foreign migrant workers, and every supply chain, global supply chain has it, has foreign migrant workers. Now, this population, I mean, we absolutely have appreciated that they are at the extreme end of the global inequality spectrum, and this pandemic has clearly brought that out. I mean, in no uncertain terms. But even earlier, they were subject to, the modern slavery. They were, their passports were retained. There were a whole lot of issues even before, and now, of course, it'll only widen. So our accelerated work in this area began in 2017 when our workplace assessments started getting red flags. At that point, there was not so much of attention. This predates the, the various legislation, the California Transparency Act, the UK Slavery Act. But, we at that point went and tried to understand what exactly is this issue. And then we kind of, once we learned the various nuts and bolts of this, the problem, we updated our policies to kind of specifically, prohibit forced labor and human trafficking in our supply chain and included it in our auditing protocol. We are also a founder member of the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment, and we have publicly committed to the 3 principles which was alluded to by Tara, which is, about the no passport retention. The worker does not pay for the recruitment fees, because it's that recruitment fees which results in, a debt bondage situation where it takes them up to 2 to 3 years at times to pay back, what they have incurred in terms of debt. And the third part, which is extremely important, is the contract substitution which happens. Now, given that we were getting more deeply into this and understanding the various dynamics and dimensions, we realized that there were 2 issues that we had to address. The first is that, many of the issues that I talked about, happened in the source country, the considered country of origin, and not the receiving country where they land up in our, our factories, whether it's our bottling, whether it's our supplier locations. And the second part is specifically with respect to the question of contract substitution, or contract swapping as it's called. The auditing and due diligence did not reach that point where this, the contracting happened. And so we were looking for some way to address this issue, because otherwise we won't really be dealing with it holistically. We'll only be dealing with it at the tip of the iceberg. And so we kind of looked at technology. And we were looking at specifically at blockchain powered solution. As I think several of you would know, it's a extremely it has the potential of increasing transparency, accountability, efficiency, wherever it is used. So towards the end of last year, in collaboration with one of our bottlers in the Middle East and our technology partner Diligence, we kind of piloted this in our facility there. The whole idea is that the contracts are put onto a blockchain powered registry. It is impossible to make changes to that, and there's also a very unique identification number which is given, so a responsible employer can actually go back and check, or if they're you're doing auditing, the auditors can be given access to check the veracity and the terms. Now this app based the feature functionality also allows a lot of other information, like the countries of origin of the workers, whether the passports are being retained, whether there is recruitment fees which is given. And so it has a lot of opportunity to kind of use it the way you really want to use it. And we've kind of taken the feedback from workers. In fact, we trained them to use it, and we got good feedback that it was simple to use, and the contract could be kept on the on their phones and in the app. The human resources teams also felt there was seamless deployment and onboarding of workers. Now, this is one part. The second part we were to do now, but we couldn't do, which is we wanted to go to the country of origin, onboard the recruitment agencies and the workers, so that we have an end-to-end model. And as Tara mentioned, it is important to have a proper business case for the ethical recruitment agency. It has to be viable. It can't be just that one ethical business organization goes and says we are going to hire 5 workers. It has to be viable for them to kind of take all those measures. And here is an opportunity for collaboration where like-minded businesses can come, so that you can build density around your recruitment and make it a viable proposition for the recruitment agency. And the last point I'd like to say is the recovery phase. Again, there's chances of increased risk, and therefore this is we need to kind of test more such tools to really make sure that we have this end-to-end models in place to address these risks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shubha and Tara, and Shubha for sharing a lot of detail in what I know is tight time limits. But I think people will be very interested both in your and H&M's very concrete experiences of how due diligence changes and where technology can be a benefit to that. And this is a question that pre-existed COVID-19 and where it hits some limits. When what we're trying to get at is worker voice, worker insights, and trust from stakeholders to give that kind of feedback. So I think some of the uses and ways in which it can add are coming through in the conversation already. Just a reminder to everybody who's joined us, this was announced at the start, but please put questions in the Q&A function. As I'm sure you'll appreciate, we have about close to 500 people joining us, so we won't be able to get to all the questions. There are already 40, but the UNDP team is kindly working with us to help filter some of the key themes, and so I'll use them, the issues that are rising to the surface from across all of the questions we're getting, to put back to panelists in the last part of this session. I'm going to ask everybody to, in order to ensure that we get to that, to keep the rest of your responses a little bit shorter, to a maximum of 4 minutes, please, if you'd be so kind, to make sure that we get a chance to then add some of these questions coming from the audience into the mix. So I wanted to turn Payal back to you, and Tara to you one more time, and really put a point on the question of purchasing practices, because it's been mentioned, but we know that that is an area where the standards that companies set for their suppliers and partners can often be in tension with the actual way in which purchasing practices are carried out. This is again a pre-existing problem, but COVID has put a real pressure on that, even in some cases an existential pressure for some businesses. How can companies, what is H&M's specific experience, and then Tara, your view on other companies. How can companies at this time manage the interactions between the standards they're setting for suppliers and their purchasing practices, and the very real risks to workers that we've seen resulting where that's not managed well? Payal, let me come to you first, because H&M came out quite early on with a decision, particularly around how you would, or rather would not, exercise force majeure clauses in your contract. So if you can speak to this, that would be great.
Every organization has their purchasing practices and purchasing contracts when we start business with our contractual partners. We have been continuously reminding ourselves the need for a strong, tighter partnership with our business partners. And we have had partners with us working for as long as 20 years, and some, of course, new, depending on the new type of products and needs that we have based on the customer demands. But constantly working with our purchasing practices policy has been something which we have been working through. But even so, for the last 5 years, when we have really defined the policies, we have also been able to measure the progress on the purchasing practices commitment that we have made internally. And how do we measure that internally? We have, our business partners sending us surveys, sending us feedbacks about how we purchase, how we have a deviation and elasticity over months and over seasons of plans. So that has been our own way of measurement. But for the last 5 years, since 2015, we have also joined ACT, the Action Collaboration Transformation platform, together with other brands and international trade unions, where we want to work on purchasing practices which is more uniform, and work on the progress indicators together, where we are able to also transparently share our performance towards our business partners, and those then performance indicators would be comparable and be visible for the industry, which creates an equal demand towards us as corporate to deliver a continuous performance on the way we buy, because we know that that has a clear impact on the workers' wages, clear impact on even setting expansion and innovation plans by our supplier partners in order to set some long-term sustainable strategies with our business partners. By partnering, or by working with ACT, where we were one of the lead organizations in terms of establishing ACT, because we felt like we will not be able to solve this individually. We also have enabled the collaboration, but the power to change within the industry with the help of this collaboration. So we also believe that not only partnering within our industry, this has also reflected that how can we work across the industry and highlight the importance of public affairs work that we feel is really important. And one of the examples is in Cambodia, where the laws were weak, and we wanted to make full-on an intervention when it comes to the freedom of association law on the ground. So I think we can say that more focus on public affairs will be continuous, and how this will exactly reflect within our own organization and our work moving forward is still to be decided.
Thank you, Payal. Tara, briefly from you.
Yeah, thank you, Payal. And actually, you made excellent points that are very much in line in the way that I was looking to frame my response to this question. I would like to respond to this question in terms of commitment, communication, and collaboration. So with commitment, As challenging as it may seem right now, especially for businesses that are in survival mode, it is vital that companies try to prioritize purchasing practices that will benefit both their business and that of their suppliers in the longer term. It was wonderful to hear that H&M has 20-year-long partnerships with business partners. This is the kind of commitment that we like to see. Cancellations without compensation for goods already purchased, suspensions, shutdowns. For businesses already operating with a very low profitability margin, it is the workers that will be impacted hardest, and especially migrant workers. So companies should take this opportunity to consider longer-term commitments and relationships with suppliers. This will make it easier to navigate the hard times moving forward by all actors. When suppliers have greater contract security, their workers are better protected. It would be short-sighted not to support suppliers to commit to their workers at this time. Upholding standards and retaining workers to the extent that it is possible now will be a competitive advantage once the economies kick back in. If all migrant workers are sent home, it can be a heavy undertaking to recruit them once again. Furthermore, longer-term commitments make it easier to motivate suppliers and associated recruitment actors to take steps to ensure that their workplace standards meet those of their buyers. Creating a tool like the Responsible Recruitment Due Diligence Toolkit and making it available is not enough. IOM has also developed training packages based on lessons learned to support suppliers and recruitment agencies to understand why and how to implement ethical recruitment and employment practices. Now, this kind of meaningful engagement is only possible with commitment from brands, suppliers, and all business partners. Now, communication. Companies should be proactive about communicating with their suppliers and workers to understand the specific challenges that they are now facing and to co-create solutions. And I've been delighted to hear this reiterated by a couple of speakers on this panel. Communicating directly with workers not only strengthens ongoing risk mitigation, but can also provide real-time and essential feedback on measures that are being taken. So a great example of this in the toolkit that we have created are tailored worker interview questionnaires. So these tools are excellent for employers to conduct a bit of a gap analysis of a business's own self-assessment, as well as to capture any grievances that have not been captured through other means. And last but certainly not least, as Kyle also flagged, collaboration. Industry-wide collaboration, including CSOs and trade unions, is vital for business to ensure that they have the influence and capacity necessary to support suppliers to meet their standards. Now more than ever, companies should be sharing information about their product and labor supply chains and coordinating decisions associated with their purchasing practices to share responsibility and to mitigate potential collateral damage associated with the difficult decisions. Now, furthermore, through industry collaborations, such as the Responsible Business Alliance, or as Shubha mentioned, the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment, companies can jointly share and develop the tools necessary to respond to risk assessments. So IOM is proud to be working with a number of associations to produce due diligence toolkits that are tailored for their memberships. Now, while not directly related to purchasing practices, IOM also sees great potential for business to go beyond the tiers of their supply chains to see what they can do to support communities of migrant workers hardest hit by this pandemic through activities to support reintegration and re-employment. So again, commit, communicate, and collaborate.
Thanks, Tara and Pyle. I want to come back to Christina and Livio to round us off, but before I do, just Shubha and Pyle, a couple of the questions that are aggregated from the large number of questions that are coming in, I want to give you a heads up on so you can reflect on them and be ready to come in. Questions relating to additional costs. So you talked about a range of new measures, types of technology, approaches that you're using. Are there additional costs to these, and what are the implications for some of your business partners, particularly for SMEs? I think there's a lot of interest coming through from the audience about how can larger companies work with SMEs who are their partners in these particularly challenging circumstances where their businesses are facing different challenges to implement improved procedures. So just to flag that with you. Christina and Livio, to come back to you both, we've heard a lot about what businesses can do individually, collectively, with partners, the role of government. From your different perspectives, what are the 2 to 3 most important messages that you would each have for governments as they look at how to either require, as we heard is now under consideration, support or otherwise incentivize businesses to take action on heightened human rights risks related to COVID-19? Christina, let me come to you first, and then Livio.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, of course, governments are one of our key stakeholders at the OECD, and we have been in touch with our adherent countries throughout the crisis, and for example, our global forum. The first part of our global forum 2 weeks ago focused on COVID and included sessions on how governments are ensuring that the recovery is also sustainable and responsible. So you've said, you've asked us to highlight 2 or 3. I had a few more messages, but I'll try and select a few. But one thing that was really important during the crisis is that governments also sent out a clear message that human rights and responsible business conduct had to continue. The economy might have been freezed or slowed down, but that didn't mean that that the expectations that companies behave responsibly were lowered. And we've seen a few governments, for example, issuing clear notes. For example, the Australian NCP issued a note on how to apply the OECD guidelines in times of crisis. So they issued a note with a simplified version of the guidelines, so less pages, but exactly the same message is saying this of course still applies. So I think this leadership by government is really crucially important. Of course, including human rights and responsible business expectations in recovery packages, we've heard that over and over again, is essential. And Commissioner Reinders also mentioned that this needs to be part of our new normal. I'm not going to elaborate on that because clearly that's something that has been said over and over again. But this also needs incentives for companies. I mean, one thing is to expect it. Another thing is really to provide incentives to do so. And we know that, for example, the European Green Deal includes numerous incentives to companies really to either continue doing the right thing or change tack and move from a carbon intensive economy to a low carbon economy. So with policy incentives and also financial incentives. So this is really also something that governments need to do. And of course, as part of the recovery, ensuring that the funds go really to increase value for society and not to increase value for shareholders is also a very important requirement. And we have seen governments that have conditioned recovery support to companies not distributing dividends to the shareholders, but ensuring that they keep the workers and invest in the sustainable future of the companies. Of course, public procurement is a huge lever also for a sustainable recovery. And in this respect, our project on responsible business conduct in public procurement will also focus on the good and the bad practices during the crisis, on how governments can also be better prepared to lead by example in their purchases, in their purchasing practicing during and after crisis. And I will finish also to highlighting that enabling dispute resolution and access to remedy is crucially important. It should be part of recovery packages and should also be something that governments offer to stakeholders, not only as part of recovery packages, but also as part of behavior by companies during the crisis. And we have seen already the first case coming to one of our NCPs regarding the behavior of a company vis-a-vis its workers during the COVID crisis. And more broadly, I mean, NCPs and other remedy mechanisms have a huge role to play in dealing with the behavior of companies in or after emergency situations. There has also been a case to the Australian NCP, for example, following the bushfires, and the relationship between company behavior, climate change, and the impact that that had on bushfires. So access to remedy is also certainly something that governments have to ensure. And I'll use my last seconds to mention that the second part of our global forum, which is taking place next week on the 17th of June, will focus on access to remedy, not focusing only on COVID, but of course the discussions around COVID will be part of the forum. So I'll finish here and hand over to Livio. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. And thank you, Rachel, for bringing in a pillar one perspective to the discussion of human rights due diligence, for the opportunity to highlight the duty of the governments to ensure that human rights are not abused, including by asking companies through a smart mix. It's a word that hasn't been used a lot in this forum. Let me use the smart mix of voluntary and mandatory measures to ask companies to conduct human rights due diligence, also in times of COVID-19. Now, this issue has been discussed at length yesterday during the NAP sessions. We have actually heard already some initiatives from the government of Mongolia that is drafting a national action plan and tying it to their social economic recovery plan and tying human rights to their plan and to business and human rights. We've heard also from Thailand that similar efforts are ongoing. You asked what messages, three messages that I would like to send, three expectations that I have. Number one, I would like messages like the one we have heard from Commissioner Reinders to be made available by more countries. What Ambassador Tapiola yesterday summarized as saying, we will not leave our ethics principles behind. This is a message that countries had to send to set the tone of what their expectations are on companies. Similarly, we heard yesterday the Swedish Sustainable Ambassador talking about democracy, rule of law, human rights at the center of the recovery. These are strong messages the government can and should be sending. I'm referring to EU countries, but we also know that EU has inspired Asia on NAPs and on many other issues. And so I do hope, and we are advocating obviously for countries in Asia to follow on the footsteps of EU countries in embracing strong principles of mixed principles of mandatory and voluntary due diligence. Second point, setting expectations. And in this sense, let me go back very briefly to our tool, which I said earlier, we have created for companies to self-assess what the risks are. But one interesting aspect is that we were contacted soon after by governments in Latin America, in this case, because it was translated in Spanish language, Guatemala and Chile, I believe. And these governments asked us to use that checklist to set their own expectations. So as much as companies were a bit in the dark at the beginning on what are the exact issues that we should be looking at, the same apply to governments. So governments now have a number of tools. I'm not here promoting necessarily the UNDP tool. I've heard about the IOM tool, which I'm sure is excellent on the recruiting procedures. I have seen the excellent page that Shift has also issued. There is now a number of documents that go into illustrating what are the steps that need to be taken to prevent human rights abuses in times of pandemics. I would like governments to adopt them and set clear expectations of corporate behavior in that sense. And certainly, as far as we are concerned, in the 11 countries where we are working here in Asia, we will be advocating for that to be the case. Third point, and last, I would like, this was mentioned by others, but cannot be stressed enough, we would like governments to lead by example, asking state-owned enterprises to go first and give the examples to others. We would like the governments to look at the procurement and make sure that uses the lens of human rights in times of COVID-19. Very last point, it's on, again, expectations. Those governments that are accessing funding from the government, and we know there are many, and they should be accessing government's funds for the recovery. I think it's legitimate to ask these governments to set expectations for those companies that are accessing support to be leading and ensuring they do not violate human rights. I'll leave it at that. Sorry if I've been a little longer, Rachel. Over to you.
Thank you, Livio and Christina. Those are some extremely important connections you've both drawn. And actually, they speak to a number of the questions that were coming up in the Q&A about the connection to the role of governments. I want to come back to all of you and put a couple of questions that are general, I think, to all the panelists. Christina, you really touched on the importance of remedy, and I think everybody is always hungry. Everyone who works on these issues is always hungry for illustrations of where we are seeing pathways to remedy and outcomes on remedy working or possible, or new ones created to try to deal with these challenges. So I think that's an open question to panelists. If others have anything that they want to add on that, specifically on the topic of migrant workers, of course, which we've looked at, or more broadly. I also would invite all panelists to comment on whether, this is probably a question particularly, but not only for the two companies, the challenges of pushing this beyond tier one. I think it's been implicit in a number of your comments that, and certainly in some of the specific practices you talked about, that this is about going further and deeper into the supply chain. If you can make that clear in your responses or in anything further you want to emphasize, I think that would be very helpful, because I think it's good to be clear to participants that when we're looking for vulnerability and we're looking for connections to impacts, that's something that goes well beyond tier one. And a third overarching question for the group is really about the connection that Christina and Livio were just making to the role of the state, and to the extent to which these international standards that we have, the OECD guidelines, the UN guiding principles, the extent to which they're shaping and guiding company action, and where it's helpful to have them formalized. Whether it's through mandatory measures, but then also with the supporting incentives that Christina was talking about, public procurement and other forms of support and incentives, as I said, that the state can offer. So if you have a view on that mix and whether COVID-19 changes your feeling, as Livio, I think, was indicating in his comments there, about what more we might need that is required from the state side. To really drive progress on this. So Payal and Shubha, I'll come to you, and then Tara and Christina and Livio. And I think because of the time, we're only going to have the opportunity to do one round. So I'd ask you to comment on those specific issues. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Rachel. So I'll just go very quickly to the, the first part of your question, whether one is going beyond tier one suppliers. And I'll take the example of the sugar supply chain. Absolutely, we're going down to the farms. We understand the complexities. I'm talking specifically about India because I manage this region. There are huge smallholder farmers where, that's where the issues really lie. These studies that I talked about focused on child labor, forced labor, land rights, specifically with respect to the farms, and the kind of remediation that we are looking at, which I, explained in more detail during my session, is very much, on the ground, where we are looking for other like-minded cross, sectoral partners to come and join us. So that work is happening, as we speak. A little delay because of the pandemic, but we're very much, focused and wanting to do that. Now, the second part of the question that you asked about, for our suppliers, especially SMEs, how do they kind of meet these standards? We are extremely mindful of the difficulties. Even for big brands, at times these are very, very complex, so all the more difficult. And our approach always has been collaborative. We have long-standing relationships with our, we are one 33-year-old company. We have long-standing relations with suppliers. Our approach to this whole thing is that, we are building capability. We are constantly looking for solutions which are sustainable, which are scalable, which also makes sense from a financial point of view. So just to give you an example, we do this auditing the workplace assessments on a global scale, 200 countries. So you can imagine the kind of scale and the supply chain where we have. And we found that other brands, in the FMCG space also have some similar workplace assessments. So very mindful of the fact that these add to the costs and, the difficulties for our suppliers, especially the small, smaller of the suppliers. We kind of collaborated under the umbrella called AIM Progress, which is Association d'Industrie de Marque, where there are about more than 40, top brands. And we've come together and we have something called the mutual recognition framework. So if, a supplier has done for another brand which has similar standards, then we accept, and vice versa. And apart from that, these pilots that I talked about, the idea is that we find technological cheaper solutions, we build density. Once we make it viable and we build density, then the costs go down. So a number of such measures we've taken, extremely mindful of the difficulties of our supply chain partners.
Thank you, Shubha. Payal, please.
I will take it from the second question where Shubha left. So just to continue would be easier when it comes to our partnerships. I think this is exactly the same that we also talked about, long-standing partnerships with our suppliers and continue to focus on scorecards. But the starting point in terms of sustainable sourcing, that starts to become a first phase of how we onboard a new supplier, then whether it is an SME or even a large-scale brand. But continuing knowing the compliance and the work that brands have done, we also understand the audit fatigue and the costs related to our manufacturers in terms of securing all the compliance measures. To start with, I think as Shubha mentioned, also the textile garment industry is working with sustainable Apparel Coalition, where more than 200 brands are members, creating one solution, which is more that if you got certified or audited or checked by that verifying organization, so you have your sustainability requirements on the social as well as on the environment side met, and we accept those tools and we accept that solutions. Coming back to the partnership and our work engagement with SMEs, of course, it starts definitely from small and then we continue to grow. And the tools that I think Tara mentioned, the available tools in the industry are there to support the SMEs in order to secure the human rights due diligence, in order to secure the business risk, in order to secure the mitigation plans whenever these issues come up. And the capability development, the competence building, we as an organization being offices in different sourcing markets, we support our partners to gradually develop into those capability models. Quickly going back to the second.
Very quickly, please, Payal. Apologies, we're really going to be strict on time.
Yeah, and again, talking about the second part, which is also about our decisions in terms of tier one. Of course, the contractual relationship starts with tier one, but when it comes to human rights, we look at all the tiers and work with where we have the biggest impact, whether it is for cotton farmers or whether it is for viscose production or whether it is for our tier one supply chain.
Thank you. Tara, let me come to you. And if you can, apologies, keep it brief because I want to give Christina and Livio each a final word as well.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to quickly respond to the question on remedy. It's always a tough topic, and I'm delighted to hear that there will be an event next week that will be diving a little bit further into this. Just to say that, given the complexity of the issues that can be faced by workers, there's never a quick fix, right? And so I wanted to highlight that IOM has been doing some interesting work in this space. So IOM Thailand has partnered with the Royal Thai government to develop guidance on remediation, looking at the looking at the state-based opportunities for it. We are also in the early stages of developing guidance for business, looking at non-state opportunities for remedy in Malaysia, looking at both manufacturing and palm oil in the agricultural sector. So I wanted to flag that these products are coming out, and for all of the resources that I have referenced and many more that IOM is coming out with, please visit CREST, C-R-E-S-T, .iom.int and sign up to receive our newsletters, and you will get all of these materials. Thank you.
Thank you. Christina, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I will be very short. Thank you, Tara, for referring to access to remedy. Of course, remediation is part of due diligence, and giving access to remedy is an obligation for governments. As I mentioned, next week we will be discussing this at length. And of course, accessibility is a key criterion for a successful remedy mechanism. Accessibility during COVID times has been more difficult, and what we have seen is that, for example, our national contact points, which I know better maybe than other remedy mechanisms, have found ways also to organize remote mediation and to use digital technologies to be more accessible to those who are seeking remedy. And I would say that these lessons learned from the COVID crisis will persist in the future. So I think it's in the same way as we are much more accessible to speak at 3 events in different time zones in one day, I think also these mechanisms will learn from this crisis to increase their accessibility. In terms of government leadership in giving incentives, of course, initiatives like the Green Deal and the mandatory due diligence regulation in the pipeline in the EU are great incentives. What we would call for is to make sure that whatever governments do takes into account the existing tools and instruments, international standards, so the UN guiding principles, the OECD guidelines, even by governments that are not adherent to the guidelines, because they will affect business in one way or the other. So at least take them into account, don't develop anything new, and be coherent in your approaches. I think this will save time and really be beneficial for all. And then just the last point on public procurement, I mean, clearly this also will be one way in which governments can leverage human rights due diligence and responsible business conduct going forward. And this will also require training and awareness raising among government officials, because of course public procurement has also lots of limitations, and embedding these new requirements is a challenge for governments. But this is a challenge that I think will be worth it, because of course the leverage of public procurement is huge, and we will also continue working on this issue going forward. So thanks a lot for this opportunity.
Thank you, Christina. Livio, I'm going to suggest that with your final comments, you actually close us out. I wouldn't attempt to do a sum up anyway, and just my thanks to all of the panelists, and so we can end right on the hour. The final word is yours.
Thank you, Rachel. I'll close with a bravo to you for bringing in the 3 pillars in one session. And with that in mind, I'll focus also on remedy. The 2 of us have already done it. I'll continue on remedy. It used to be called the forgotten pillar. So let's emphasize more the issue of remedy. And of course, I'd like to bring in the role of national human rights institutions. They're very strong. There are many very strong national human rights institutions here in Asia. The Edinburgh Declaration, where they set their actions, does speak about their role in helping companies in human rights due diligence, and many of them are getting more and more prepared to do so. We're witnessing that because we're working very closely with them. It has taken some time, but their capacity is increasing. So I am here to recommend rights holders to also use NHRIs if they have grievances to raise, because the NHRIs can not only help in resolving them, but they can also circle back the information that they have into Pillar 1, into their role of advocating with governments on policy that need to be passed. I'll leave it at that, and I take the opportunity to thank you, Rachel.
Thank you. That leaves me 30 seconds to thank everybody and everybody who joined and for bearing with us in this virtual mode, and look forward to seeing everyone again when it's possible. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.